In the final years of his life, John Lennon carried more than fame, more than legend. He carried memories. Memories of music that changed the world and of a friendship that once felt unbreakable. For decades, he and Paul McCartney had been two halves of the same soul, partners in creation, rivals in ambition, brothers in all but name. But as the years went on, silence grew louder between them. And before the end came, Lennon finally decided to speak. Not to defend, not to attack, but to tell the truth about the one man who had shaped his life the most. The beginning. When John met Paul. It was July 6, 1957, an ordinary summer afternoon in Liverpool that turned into one of the most defining moments in music history. John Lennon, then a 16-year-old boy with a rebellious streak and a second-hand guitar, was performing with his skiffle band, the Quarrymen, at a church event in Woolton Village. In the audience stood Paul McCartney, just 15, watching intently as Lennon sang, "Come Go With Me." After the set, a mutual friend named Ivan Vaughan introduced them. Lennon was impressed when Paul tuned a guitar with ease and played 20 Flight Rock perfectly, something John couldn't do. It wasn't love at first sight, but something close to it, a recognition. Both had lost their mothers young, both were searching for meaning in music, and both saw in the other what they lacked themselves. Within weeks, Lennon invited Paul to join his band. A partnership was born that would change everything. By 1960, the Quarrymen had evolved into the Beatles. Together with George Harrison and Ringo Starr, they began their journey from the smoky clubs of Hamburg to the global stage. Lennon was the dreamer, the cynic, the sharp tongue. McCartney was the optimist, the craftsman, the melodic perfectionist. Together, they built songs that defined generations: She Loves You, A Hard Day's Night, Help, and Yesterday. Their chemistry was unmatched. Lennon once said, "We wrote our best stuff when we were eyeball to eyeball." McCartney later echoed, "It was like looking into a mirror. Different, but the same." But beneath the brilliance, cracks were forming. The pressure of fame, the endless touring, and their own differences began to eat away at the bond. Lennon's growing insecurities and McCartney's relentless drive made for a volatile mix. Still, through it all, the friendship held, for a time. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about identity. Lennon once confessed that Paul pushed him to be better, to write harder, to think differently. Yet he also admitted it was exhausting. He was the workaholic, Lennon said. He'd come in with a song when I was trying to have a break. But that's Paul. That's who he is. As the 1960s progressed, their musical paths began to diverge. McCartney's Yesterday hinted at his growing fascination with structure and classical influence, while Lennon's Strawberry Fields Forever explored raw emotion and introspection. Still, they found a way to meet in the middle, especially on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, a masterpiece that redefined modern music. But the very success that united them also became the burden that broke them. When their manager Brian Epstein died in August 1967, it left a hole none of them knew how to fill. Epstein had been the glue, the one who balanced egos and handled chaos. Without him, Lennon felt directionless. "After Brian died, we collapsed," Lennon later admitted. "Paul took over and supposedly led us. But what is leading us when we went round in circles?" McCartney tried to hold the band together, pushing them to keep working, to stay creative. But to Lennon, it felt like control. And slowly, resentment began to replace trust. The tragedy of Lennon and McCartney wasn't that they stopped caring. It was that they cared too much. Both wanted the Beatles to endure, but in different ways. Lennon needed freedom. McCartney needed order. Lennon once said, "We were on the same escalator all the way up. Same step, same speed. But once we reached the top, I didn't know where to go. Paul did. He always did. The fall, the cracks within the Beatles." By 1968, the harmony that had once united the Beatles was quietly crumbling. What began as creative tension soon became emotional exhaustion. The recording sessions for the White Album were long, painful marathons where smiles had vanished and tempers replaced laughter. McCartney, driven by perfection, pushed for control, tightening arrangements, redoing takes endlessly, trying to keep the music alive. Lennon, however, was drifting further into his own world, exploring new drugs, new philosophies, and the growing presence of Yoko Ono by his side. Their partnership, once built on unspoken understanding, began to feel like a contest. Lennon mocked Paul's granny music, while Paul grew tired of Lennon's cynicism and lack of focus. Even George Harrison, long patient in the background, started to rebel, demanding recognition for his songs. The Beatles' music remained brilliant, but behind every track was an argument, a bruise, a silence. When their beloved manager Brian Epstein died in 1967, the band lost more than a leader. They lost balance. Epstein had been the steady hand that managed egos and shielded them from chaos. In the void he left, McCartney tried to take charge, but his efforts only deepened the rift. He pushed for projects like Magical Mystery Tour and Let It Be, hoping to keep the band moving, but the others saw it as control. Lennon later said, "The film was set up by Paul, for Paul." He no longer felt like an equal partner. "We were fed up being sidemen for Paul," he said bitterly. The group that had once functioned like brothers now felt like a fragile company falling apart. As tensions mounted, Lennon's newfound openness with Yoko Ono alienated the rest. For the first time, someone else was sitting beside him during sessions, commenting, influencing. Paul later admitted that the band wasn't equipped to handle it emotionally. "It was like watching an old army buddy fall in love and drift away," he said. "You understand it, but it still hurts." Then came the final blow, the business war. McCartney wanted Lee Eastman, his father-in-law, to handle the band's finances, while Lennon championed the sharp-tongued New Yorker Alan Klein. The vote was 3-1, with Paul alone in opposition. The decision fractured what little unity remained. From that moment, every meeting turned into a confrontation. Every song became a statement of independence. By 1970, it was over. When McCartney released his solo album and confirmed what everyone feared, that the Beatles had broken up, Lennon was furious. "I started the band," he said coldly. "I disbanded it. The dream is over." But beneath the anger, both men felt the same ache, the unbearable loss of something they had built together from nothing and could never rebuild again. The war of words, Lennon versus McCartney. After the breakup, their friendship didn't just fade, it exploded. In 1971, McCartney released Ram, an album filled with veiled frustration and private pain. The opening track, Too Many People, contained a line Lennon immediately recognized as an attack. Too many people preaching practices. Paul later admitted, "It was about John and Yoko. I felt they were telling everyone how to live, and I was tired of it." Lennon didn't let it slide. His answer came swiftly. Imagine was a message to the world, but one song, How Do You Sleep, was a dagger aimed directly at Paul. "The only thing you done was yesterday," Lennon sneered. "And since you've gone, you're just another day." Even George Harrison joined in on guitar, making the betrayal cut deeper. The bitterness shocked fans who once saw them as brothers. Ringo Starr, who visited the session, said he couldn't believe how cruel the lyrics were. Lennon later tried to soften the blow, saying he had been using resentment as fuel, but the words had already done their damage. McCartney responded differently, not with anger, but with sorrow. On his next album with Wings, he wrote, "Dear Friend," a quiet plea asking if this was really the borderline of their relationship. "It was me reaching out," he said years later. Lennon never answered publicly, but those who knew him said the song moved him. Still, Pride and hurt kept them apart. For a time, they spoke only through headlines, interviews, and songs. What had once been a shared dream had turned into a cold war fought with music. Yet behind the words, both men were mourning the same thing, the loss of a friendship that had once felt like family. The unexpected reunion, the lost weekend. By 1974, John Lennon's life had spiraled into what he later called his lost weekend, a chaotic 18-month separation from Yoko Ono, filled with late nights, alcohol, and music that blurred into noise. He was living in Los Angeles, producing Harry Nilsson's Pussycats album, surrounded by friends who enabled his wild behavior. It was during this strange, unruly chapter that something extraordinary happened. Paul McCartney walked through the studio door. It had been years since they had seen each other, and for a brief moment it felt like the old days. Lennon later said, "I jammed with Paul. We did a lot of stuff in L.A., though there were 50 other people playing, all just watching me and Paul." The tape of that night, now known as a toot and a snore in '74, captured their voices together one last time. The music was messy, the sound barely coherent, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were in the same room again. For a few hours, rivalry was replaced with laughter, and the walls between them began to fall. That same year, McCartney quietly played a part in Lennon's reconciliation with Yoko. When Yoko visited London, she told Paul she was considering taking John back. Paul carried the message to Lennon in New York, telling him, "She still loves you." John followed his advice, and before long, he and Yoko were together again. Lennon would later say, "That was Paul, you know. Underneath it all, he's a good guy." Their reunion didn't last beyond that night in Los Angeles, but it was a fragile reminder of what had once been. Even through the noise, the bitterness, and the fame, Lennon and McCartney could still find their way back to each other, if only for a fleeting song. The final years, regret and reflection. After returning to New York in 1975, Lennon's life began to quiet down. He reunited with Yoko Ono, and together they welcomed their son, Sean, that October. For the first time in years, John stepped away from music completely. He became a stay-at-home father, cooking breakfast, reading books, and finding peace in domestic life. But even in that stillness, one shadow remained: Paul. They had stopped trading insults and interviews by then. The anger had faded into distance. "I realized I couldn't always call him about business," Paul later said. "It was better to talk about cats, or baking bread, or babies." The two old friends began speaking again, cautiously, as if afraid that one wrong word might reopen old wounds. Lennon would later joke, "He visits me every time he's in New York, like all the other rock and roll creeps." But beneath the humor was affection. He enjoyed those moments. Two fathers now, talking about ordinary things after years of chaos. In April 1976, one of those nights almost became history. Lennon and McCartney were together at Lennon's apartment watching Saturday Night Live when producer Lorne Michaels jokingly offered the Beatles $3,000 to reunite. Lennon turned to Paul and said, "It's only downtown. We could go now." For a brief second, they nearly did. "We nearly got a cab," Lennon said later, "but we were too tired." That moment, light and spontaneous, was the last time they saw each other. In the years that followed, Lennon began recording again, preparing for a comeback with double fantasy. He sounded lighter, wiser, but when he spoke of Paul, his words carried something deeper than nostalgia. It was understanding, tinged with the ache of things left unsaid. The confession before the end. In the final months of his life, John Lennon seemed at peace, at least on the surface. He was back in love with Yoko, enjoying his son, and making music again. But beneath that calm exterior, there was reflection, even remorse. He had spent years building walls, against fame, against the Beatles, and sometimes against Paul. Yet as he prepared to re-enter the world, Lennon began to look backward with tenderness rather than anger. In one of his last interviews, he finally spoke honestly about McCartney, not as a rival, but as the partner who had defined half his life. "There's only ever been two artists I've worked with for more than one night," Lennon told RKO Radio. "That's Paul McCartney and Yoko Ono. I think that's a pretty damn good choice." It was a quiet, heartfelt acknowledgement from a man who rarely gave compliments. Even in his sharpest moments, Lennon had always known the truth, that Paul was the only person who truly understood what it was like to be him. Friends later recalled that Lennon sometimes wore a small pin that said, "I love Paul." When asked why, he simply replied, "Because I love Paul." It wasn't a grand gesture, just honesty, stripped of pride. For years they had written songs that spoke for a generation, but the one thing they could never fully say to each other was what they both felt, love mixed with regret. On December 8th, 1980, that chance for reconciliation vanished. Lennon was shot outside his home in New York City. When Paul heard the news, he was shattered. "It was like Kennedy," he said softly. "Just so sad. I wasn't going to see him again." For McCartney, it wasn't just the end of a friendship. It was the final verse of a song that would never be finished. In the end, John Lennon and Paul McCartney's story wasn't just about music. It was about two men growing up, growing apart, and still finding their way back to each other through words, memories, and songs. Lennon's final words about Paul weren't bitter. They were full of love, the kind that survives distance, pride, and even death. Their partnership began with a handshake in a churchyard and ended with silence that still echoes through every melody they wrote together. Do you think, if John had lived longer, he and Paul would have reunited? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories from music history.